Hello, everybody. Welcome into the College Basketball Bonanza in this middle portion of September of 2020, and it's been quite the ride over this past week or so. I'm Nicholas Hodell, Dominic Stern, as always, joining me here. Dom, we're getting into the group of things back in our newest semester. How's it going, my man?
It's good. It's very busy over here. I'm working on, I think, now 5 or 6 podcasts, including this one with you. So, sports are back, and so is my hefty workload. But I'm handling it well. Everything's all right over here. I can't wait for basketball to be back.
Absolutely. And, even though we may get a little later start to the basketball season than what we normally see, it could very well involve bubbles. And that has been a popular term in sports during this pandemic. And it's looking like college basketball will not be an exception to that rule. On Tuesday, CBS Sports' Matt Norlander reported the first major bubble proposal has documentation with the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. That plan right now includes the Hall of Fame tip-off and the Hall of Fame Invitational, with the potential for teams from the Empire Classic, Legends Classic, and the Gotham Classic to be included, all tournaments in the New York area. And as we see more potential for groups of MTs to come together, I think that this could be a smart move for college basketball as a whole to get these MTs grouped together. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, Dom.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense because things have changed since last year's MTEs, and it's a way for there to be some non-conference college basketball because you can have those singular non-conference games with like your home and home series, stuff like that. But if you want to have these big tournaments or the MTEs, you're going to have to find ways to group them in bubbles or just have them in bubbles in general. And to have the teams be in a bubble and just one bubble at a time, like if you were to send the players to Maui and stuff like that, this doesn't seem reasonable anymore. So I think those types of forms of bubbles, we should definitely expect to see them this year. They could possibly be seeing them going forward, which I think would really suck. But, who knows at this point? It's a wait and see type of thing.
Yeah, and I'll say that this sort of the bubbles I think that we're going to see are only going to be temporary. I don't think we're going to see them come up on a yearly basis in the bubble sense. I think that this is a definite COVID effect, and I think it's only going to happen during this pandemic. And I think that having the MTs in their own little bubbles as one MTE alone, I'm not sure if that's going to work the best. I think that having the groups of MTs would be the best possible option because let's be honest here. This pandemic's not going to go away in December. It's not going to go away in January. We're still going to be living with some of these effects, even if they are in a minor phase compared to what we had when everything shut down. And I think that the groups of MTEs, 2 or 3 of them in one bubble, may have the potential for more as we're seeing some of that documentation from the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. I think that is going to be very good for the game because you have high major teams, you have mid-major teams of all different levels that I think you get some very good games in regardless. But I think that becomes another question here. How much of an impact could specific bubbles become for NCAA tournament consideration? I think that's a question we need to really look at here.
Yeah, and considering the fact that the tournament committee values every single game the same in terms of no matter how early or how late it was, which is a whole nother conversation, these games all of a sudden become super important, and how these bubbles are handled is going to affect whether some teams make March Madness or they don't in the field of 64/68. So it's a really peculiar situation because you want to have these bubbles, you want to have non-conference play. Some conferences may not be able to participate, like the Pac-12 and the Ivy League, who aren't participating at the moment in 2020 at all. But it's a very odd situation because the bubbles, if they just falter and some teams get stuck with some really odd situations, that could end up affecting their resume in a negative aspect. And some could be positive, but it's a really interesting situation with these MTEs.
Yeah, and that one important metric, the strength of schedule, I think is going to be heavily impacted because I think that a lot of normal non-conference schedules are not going to be able to go off as they are. And I think that's a critical thing to look at. And another thing that I think would be a big thing to look at is that John Robstein, his sources are telling that perhaps up to 8 would be the number that some conferences would go to, some executives informing their programs of that. And I think that number would be a pretty solid number. 8 non-conference games, that kind of gets you a good momentum before you go into your 18, 20, how many other games you play, 16, 18, 20, whatever that number would be. And I think that the strength of schedule, the non-conference, is going to become important because as we've seen pretty much every year, strength of schedule relies on your conference a lot. And I think that depending on what bubbles you get into, that'll slightly impact that strength of schedule. And if you're able to get some quality wins, that's going to help you out a lot, especially since all these games now become neutrals. They all become neutral games. And you know me, I value neutral games on a resume a lot. And I think that is going to be very, very important for that NCAA tournament consideration. Yesterday, though, the ACC coaches decided, let's get a little wild and propose an all-inclusive NCAA tournament where every eligible team would get in. Sorry, Oklahoma State, you still probably wouldn't qualify for that even. And it's crazy because Coach K was the one that put out a statement citing the health and safety of the players, the fact that college basketball is unified and celebrating the sport. But is this even remotely logistical?
I don't know if it's logistical, and I don't think it's very logical. I mean, the whole point of having the tournament is to reward the best teams and the teams that are hot. And just doing this, not only is it not logistical, but you're adding all of these teams in. Like, that just seems like a COVID-19 nightmare. And it makes no sense from a college basketball perspective, and it doesn't really make sense from a health perspective. So ACC, you can try again. You'll still remain second fiddle to the Big 12, SEC, and Big 10.
And I just think that, Coach K being the one to put out a statement with that, I think was crazy. But I say logistical in my question because I think logically this makes absolutely no sense. This is about as stupid as 2020 at this point. I think the comparison can be there. An all-inclusive NCAA tournament? Are you kidding me? I mean, it's like giving everyone a participation trophy and saying, oh, here we go, March Madness for everyone. No. That's like inviting me to partake in the Masters, which would be a terrible idea.
No,
but
we don't want that for the Masters, and you're good. But the thing about it being all-inclusive is the teams that just absolutely do not belong there, those teams would get bounced real quick. So it's not like it's drastically that bad, but there's going to be some really weird teams that, frankly, just don't deserve to be there. But maybe they won like 3 of their 4 last games, and then they ran into like, a juggernaut. And then, of course, they couldn't win their conference tournament. They get into the tournament, and they find some weird way to go on a run. It just doesn't make any sense. Like I said, try again, ACC.
Yeah, and let's focus on the logistics for a little bit here, especially in a pandemic. How many bubbles would you need? 16, 20, 30? Like, I don't know how one organization can organize that many bubbles to be able to pull that off. Like, that makes it's a logistical nightmare. And I think that, first off, I mean, if you're looking for a job, then the NCAA would probably have one because it would take a massive amount of people to try to run all of these bubbles. And I just think it's insane. I just don't get it.
And a normal tournament runs with 8 sites to begin the round of 64. And so now when you improve that to over 300 teams, I mean, you either have to expand your bubbles drastically or you have to put more teams into each site. You normally got 8 teams at each site to start. And I mean, after the first day, 4 teams are eliminated. But it doesn't make any sense from NCAA, from health, and from the conference standpoint, because if you're a Power 5 team, this tournament's built for the majority of your teams to make the tournament. And at this point, you're diminishing that by letting in all these mid-major teams that, frankly, aren't on the same level as you. It's just so puzzling. When I saw it, I'm like, what? No.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous. And, doing some calculations, I think there's around 347 eligible teams, not including the 3 classifiers or APR violations or Oklahoma State. Doing some quick math came out around 21, 22 bubbles, which that makes no sense. Trying to operate 21
how many
sites,
teams?
16. That is around the number.
16.
So that's around the number that the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame currently is planning for, the 16 teams. And kind of how they put out their documentation. So based on the 16, 21 bubbles, like, no, that's ridiculous in my mind. And it's nowhere near an even number either. Let's that straight. It's like a 0.68. So it's not even an even number. It makes no sense. I mean, it's like, I respect Coach K, but not on that. That's not one I'm going to give him any sort of thing together. And now, if they're willing to pull that off, one, that's insane. Two, fair play to them, because I don't know how they're going to even pull it off with bubbles and seeding is one. That's a whole other conversation. The seeding of 350 some teams. I would not want to be on that committee. I mean, sorry. Like as much as I love evaluating teams, that's too much.
Makes zero sense.
Yeah, it really does. Now, moving away from that, we can't mention bubbles without mentioning Larry Scott's previous comments when the Pac-12 conference shut down spurring activity for the 2020 calendar year. He said that unlike professional sports, college sports cannot operate in a bubble. However, the conference's recent partnership announced with the Hodell Corporation may be turning some heads within the conference in the hope that the Pac-12 will get involved in the non-conference fund this season. So we know that the bubble comments at this point kind of seem, I don't know, like ridiculous, like, you know, like outdated. We could say, they could say that. But if things fall apart in the Pac-12's end in terms of the pandemic, and we'll get to California in a little bit, I think that's a major talking point as well for the Pac-12. If things fall apart in the Pac-12's end in terms of the coronavirus pandemic, could the conference suffer in the NCAA tournament field this season?
Well, if they don't have non-conference play, I think that borderline tournament teams in the field of 64, we must add, they will be punished slightly. And is that unfair? Somewhat, but considering the fact that almost every other conference is playing these non-conference games, you have to reward the conferences that have played more games than you. And it sucks because it's in a pandemic. I think the Pac-12 was mostly doing this to try and have a good publicity look. You know, say, hey, we don't want to put our athletes in danger. Look at us. We're trying to be safe, to try and help their public image, because as we all know, and we've addressed several times on this podcast, the Pac-12 public image sucks, and Larry Scott sucks. And I do think college sports can operate in a bubble, especially with classes being offered online. It's not like these students do have some classes in person that they're forced to attend. Now, all of a sudden, they don't have those classes. And when they don't have those classes, they can watch the class online if they are in a bubble. And it is a special occasion for this year, and I think probably going forward, you'll be able to do this. The Pac-12 will be slightly punished if they don't have a non-conference schedule. Like I said, all games matter the same no matter what the date was, non-conference or conference. So the Pac-12 will be punished here. I don't think Larry Scott really cares about how many teams get into the March Madness out of his conference, because he knows that those borderline 11, 12 seeds, if they get into the tournament, they're probably not going to win, and they're not going to make his conference look that great. Now, of course, when they show the list on SportsCenter of how many teams from each conference made it, it'll help out the Pac-12's look just a little bit. But what he really cares about is the Pac-12 logo on their jersey playing in the Final Four and those main eyes, and those teams are going to make it regardless.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, not last season, but 2 years ago, if we were to have this sort of same conversation, I would have said that this would have been a big-time punishment because the Pac-12 would have been a one-bid league. And 2 years ago, my sort of calling card, if you will, that's that the Pac-12 could have been. And if things didn't turn out as they did in the Pac-12 tournament two years ago, should have been a one-bid league. And I think that if that were the case, I think that could have been an extremely fair scenario. But last season, the conference improved, and I think that the Pac-12 isn't going to have that scenario where they're only getting 2 or 3 bids again, unless things fall apart, unless they're not able to play those non-conference games. Because while the Pac-12 as a conference has improved, or if you're in a bubble situation, are you going to take a 4th, 5th, maybe 6th place Pac-12 team that has only played their conference schedule, or are you going to take another power conference team that, while they have a shaky conference schedule, they have those quality non-conference wins? And I'd say In an NCAA tournament setting, you always take the team. If there would be those two scenarios, take the team with the proven non-conference. I don't even think that's a doubt in my mind, because you could see that fledgling Pac-12 team without any non-conference experience and get completely exposed in like a 30-point game that is in absolutely no one's interest to see play out on the NCAA's biggest stage. And I think that, yes, if they don't get into non-conference games at all, that is going to punish them a little bit. I mean, it's not going to get to the point where the Pac-12 is a one-bid league, but I do think that another 2 or 3 bid scenario could very well be likely if the teams that pan out do and teams that are on that fringe don't, and we get some other teams that have played those non-conference games and have been very successful, because I mean, a lot of these non-conference games now are going to show up as neutral games in the resume this season. And I value that very much so. And if you had that scenario, Don, with a Pac-12 team that was around 4th or 5th, only played their conference schedule, and another powered conference team that had a fledgling conference season but quality non-conference wins, who would you go for in that scenario?
I would take the Power 5 team that had the non-conference schedule, because they've already proven, hey, this is how they stack up against teams from the rest of the NCAA. I don't care how you stacked up against Pac-12. I want to see the full picture. How do you stack up against teams from your conference? How did that team stack up against teams from their conference? And how did both those teams stack up against teams from outside the conference? Because, as you know, it's very rare that you see teams play each other in March Madness. And if you do, it's Sweet 16, Elite 8, Final Four, or even the championship, and even that's rare. So if it comes down to it, they're going to take the team that played the non-conference schedule. I think that's a very easy choice for them. Now, if it's a little bit leaning towards the Pac-12 team, I think they'll take it. But if it's like a flip of the coin, they're going to say, hey, you know what? We got an easy excuse to take this team, and we're going to take it. Sorry, Pac-12, but 1, you don't draw, and 2, we have a team that played a non-conference schedule, so we can say that, and we're going to use that to our advantage.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing too is that, you know, if you have that same team 4-4, you know, 2 good wins, 1 extremely bad loss, I think that becomes an absolute debate. But again, like, you have the non-conference experience, I would take it at that point. And you know, with the Pac-12, I think the situation with the state of California is also pretty obvious in that, while we don't like to get too involved in politics here in this program, Governor Gavin Newsom of California has been one of the stricter governors in the country when it comes to certain restrictions during this pandemic. And would any other conferences be affected as much as the Pac-12 by any sort of further California action?
No, because California, 4 of the 12 Pac-12 teams are located in California. USC, UCLA, Cal, and Stanford. That's a 30-year conference. Not only that, but you got 2 teams in the north and 2 teams in the south. It would be one thing if the teams were all in the south or all in the north, but all of a sudden, both divisions of play are affected. So if restrictions go down and they say, hey, no, you can't travel, no college students can come in, which is fairly realistic, especially with Arizona, who has managed this coronavirus lockdown significantly different than California. I could definitely see something like Newsom saying, hey, no, we're not going to do this. I'm not going to make exceptions. You know, normal other people, it's different. But college students who have been living in the dorms and living in apartments, the people who have been partying and have possibly exposed themselves to COVID-19, I'm not putting my citizens at that risk. I'm not putting my students at that risk. That's definitely something feasible. Now, you'd hope that once we get further down the line that isn't as big of a deal, but like we've said, it's a wait-and-see thing. So California is a huge wild card, not only for Pac-12, but for the entire NCAA. There's several other conferences that are almost entirely California schools. You take a look at the Big West, I mean, you're talking about almost all just private schools out here in California. And then the Mountain West, you got San Diego State, you got Fresno State, you got San Jose State. You got several schools in California. So it's not only just the Pac-12, it's a bunch of other conferences that could possibly be multi-bid leagues.
Yeah, you mentioned the Big West and the West Coast Conference as well. could have some
Yeah.
very big implications. And I mean, the Big West and the West Coast would probably be the two big ones that come to mind. But I think at this point, you could say that any conference with multiple California schools could very well be grouped into this conversation. I mean, I think it is one of those situations to where that state could sort of hold things up a bit in terms of if they're going to have a big say in that, because basketball is one of those high risk sports. We cannot avoid that scenario. And I think that there are still some things in California in particular, not to really excuse any other states, but California in particular, I think could have a bigger say in things, because I mean, so I saw the news the other day that Los Angeles County had canceled trick-or-treating already. I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, what the heck is going on? And if you think about it, that just seems to be extremely par for the course with what California has been doing. And I'm sure you could speak more about that from personal experience, Don, but to me, that actually kind of seemed par for the course.
Well, California has been ahead of a lot of the lockdowns, and Newsom was ahead of it. And credit to him, he was trying to do what he felt was best for his people. I, of course, was a part of that because I am a California native. Not there now, so I can't really tell you what's going on over there just because I kind of blocked everything out. And like I said earlier on the podcast, I've got my own thing going here. I'm super busy. I'm not really too focused over there. But California, it's a liberal state, so they've been a little more concerned about the coronavirus than some of the conservative states in America. That's just how things are. I don't feel like that's too political of a statement. California, huge wild card. You just mentioned LA. LA has been hit hard by COVID-19 just because it's so densely populated, and it's a tough spot California's put itself in, and it's put the sports world in a tough spot for sure too.
Yeah, it absolutely has. And, we'll go back to the non-conference bit here for sort of the last minute thing here. I mean, the number that John Rothstein's been reporting is up to 8. What do you see? I mean, 8, more, less? What do you think is going to happen with this non-conference season, Dom?
I think 8's a fair number for the amount of games and the amount of like teams in those bubbles, because you're getting a decent sized picture. You're going to face some teams that are worse than you in a neutral site floor. You're going to see some teams that are better than you in a neutral site floor. Now, of course, the super elite high-ranked teams, it's going to be mostly the teams that are not as good as you. And you're going to see what these teams look like when a team is giving them 110% from the get-go. And if they get their back to the walls, how do they respond? And with the bubbles, that's how we normally see them at MTEs anyways. You see those 3 games in the championship, and then you send them home. That's a fair amount of time to quarantine the people for, get their tests, and see if anything happened there. So I think 8 is the magic number when it comes to college basketball this year.
Yeah, and for a power program, the normal range would be anywhere from 10 to 13. 10 probably on the lower side of it, 12 or 13 probably a little more realistic. And so 8, if you are trying to limit that contact, it does make sense. I will be curious though to see if maybe some of the smaller conferences still decide that they want to try to get a few more games other than the 8, try to get more towards the realistic 10 to 13 range. I'll be curious to see if that does happen, but I really can't see the power conferences budging from that number if they do indeed decide to stay at that number. It's just, it's a good number, I mean, the only thing to me is that some of the conferences could decide to go a little lower. Some of the conferences like the Ivy League, like the Pac-12, if they decide to get involved in 2020, I do think that those conferences could decide to take that step. But I think 8's a fine number. I really see nothing wrong with that. And I think that's a good bit to close on this edition of the College Basketball Bonanza. Thanks again, Dom, as always, for coming on. And until next time, hopefully the next episode can be actual previews, which I know you and I would freaking love that, to actually dive into some teams, I mean, we're hoping that could be the case. And the closer and closer we get, I think that is going to be very, very more realistic. So until the next episode of the College Basketball Bonanza, Dominic Stern, I'm Nick Hodell, wishing you a very good day, night, wherever you are at, whenever you are. Have a fantastic day, night, whatever your time you're watching, wherever you are.